All right, Kyle. I'm a lifelong skateboarder. You're one as well, but also a physical therapist. What's the deal with ice? I feel like we should clarify some things. Whether to ice, not to ice, and how beneficial it is for skateboarders.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to have a full-on discussion about ice, because in the medical and fitness world these days, ice has kind of become a hot topic of debate. A lot of athletes swear by it. Some physios and other medical professionals think it's the worst thing you can do to an injury or for an injury. Yeah, so I think it'd be good to just put all of these things in perspective and get some clarity. So yeah, let's do it.
Dude, that's crazy. Some really say that it's like the worst thing you can do.
Some people have strong opinions about ice, and not a good way.
Wow. Crazy. So give me a little history behind ice and how it became such a standard treatment for injuries and soreness.
Sure, yeah. Ice really became popular in the late 70s from the work of a physician, Dr. Gabe Merkin. He wrote this big old book about a sports medicine book on how to treat common injuries. And within that book, he came up with the acronym RICE. RICE stands for Rest, Ice, Compression, Elevation. So Dr. Merkin didn't actually invent that acronym, but he made it really popular in his book. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how icing took off in the sports medicine world for the common sprains and strains that athletes deal with. And the emphasis eventually just kind of honed in on the I part of the acronym, or the ice part of the acronym.
Okay.
So from there, ice packs, gel packs, ice baths, all these different forms of icing became popular. And now every sport, every training room has state-of-the-art ways to ice their athletes before and after, usually after their sport. So it's all over the place now.
And so what's the basic idea? It's weird that I'm even asking it, because you'd think, being a lifelong, quote-unquote athlete, like, you would just know what it does. But
yeah.
like, what is it actually doing?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Basically, whenever a tissue is damaged or injured, an inflammatory response occurs soon after. And this inflammatory response starts with blood vessels opening up and allowing inflammatory cells and other things to come in and help repair the injured tissue. So this inflammation is basically how the tissue heals itself. And the idea behind ice is it basically hinders the inflammatory process by doing the opposite, by constricting blood vessels, decreasing blood flow, and sort of kind of tampering or delaying this inflammatory process.
All right, so inflammation is a bad thing that happens after, like, let's say an ankle injury, and ice basically slows that down?
Well, that's the thing. No. And this is kind of where the debate starts. We've been told, or we think of inflammation as being kind of this bad thing, but actually it's not. Not only is it not bad, inflammation is normal and necessary for tissue to repair itself. So inflammation shouldn't really be thought of it as a pathology or disease. It's completely normal. So with that in mind, critics of ice will say, all right, if we really think about inflammation, it's this normal thing that the body goes through after an injury. And if ice combats inflammation, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to delay and decrease inflammation with ice when it's a vital part of tissue healing? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I get that.
Okay, yeah, so this recent better understanding of inflammation as being a necessary thing has led some physical therapists and medical professionals to completely swing to the other end of the spectrum and come to the conclusion that ice is a harmful and damaging thing to do to an injury and should never be used.
Whoa.
Yeah, so there's kind of this whole anti-ice crusade, believe it or not, that started in the health and fitness world.
Damn.
Yeah, there's this guy, Gary Reinl, who's a personal trainer. He's like a famous personal trainer and writer, and he wrote this book called Iced, and it's basically this anti-ice manifesto, like a 200-page anti-ice manifesto.
And it's called iced, like when you get iced, like a Smirnoff ice situation?
Yeah, I think so.
Iced with a D, right?
Ice with a D, yeah. Kind of like,
Yeah.
all right, we've been fooled as a society into thinking
I see.
that ice is this good thing. And actually, the foreword of the book is written by Dr. Merkin, who was the originator of the rice theory.
Really?
So he came back 30 years later and kind of recanted his views on ice. So he's kind of part of this.
Whoa.
Kind of, ironically enough, he's kind of part of this anti-ice phenomenon, even though he was the originator he kind of made icing popular. So it's kind of ironic.
Crazy. Yeah.
So anyways, that's kind of the world we're in right now. We have the history of ice just being completely popularized in the treatment of injuries, and it's used in sort of training facilities to help recover from, heavy workouts and, whatever activity you're doing, to now ice being, thought of as this kind of harmful thing in some circles.
Huh. Do you know if Merkin still stands by rest, compression, and elevation? Or is he throwing rice all out the window?
I think he stands more aligned with the R, C, and D, but
Cool.
I think he's shied away from the ice part a little bit.
He's a rec guy now, huh?
Yep.
Just REC.
REC.
So now that I'm getting a little bit better of a sense of what inflammation is and what ice is supposed to do, it seems like I should just not do it. Like I shouldn't have been icing earlier. Like what's the deal?
Yeah, I mean, you would kind of think, and if ice did what people think it does, then yeah, you'd be right. You wouldn't want to over ice an injury. But the devil's kind of in the details. Ice is not nearly as powerful at combating inflammation as people kind of think it is.
All right, so I figured there'd be some nuance to this. So what does the research say about how much ice actually decreases inflammation, if you do want to use it for that?
It actually doesn't decrease inflammation that much. Ice does decrease inflammation, but just a little bit, and not nearly as much as we think, especially when you compare it to things like ibuprofen and corticosteroids. If you think of, the analogy is basically if ice is a water gun, ibuprofen is a high-powered AK-47. There's that big of a difference. That's not. Yeah, that's not an exaggeration either.
Whoa.
So while ice does temporarily decrease blood flow and inflammation, it only does it a little bit, and in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to decrease inflammation enough to harm the body's ability to go through that whole inflammation process and heal. And there's a lot of studies that support that. So basically, ice is not the dangerous thing that these anti-icers claim it is.
Just because it's not that effective either way.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of laugh when I hear, if you go on YouTube, you can hear some of their the interviews with them, and I kind of chuckle when they talk about the dramatic detriment that ice has on the body and its ability to heal itself. It's just they just completely overshoot the effectiveness of ice. It just isn't as powerful at combating inflammation as we think it is. We give it too much credit, basically.
Yeah. Well, this is my mom's gonna be stoked to hear this, because she's just a lifelong. She's not necessarily anti-ice, but she's just ibuprofen for everything, kind of. Not like overdo it, but everything's just take an ibuprofen. It's like I feel like it was ingrained as a child to just always have the 1,000-piece ibuprofen bottle at all times. Never have a house without just endless ibuprofen.
I feel like you've kind of taken that on too. I feel like you always have a bottle of ibuprofen in your car or your backpack.
It's true. Yeah, no, it's essential.
If you really if inflammation is what you're trying to address, something like an ibuprofen would be much more effective than ice.
Yeah. It's just wild though, because I would have put ice as more important for immediate decreasing inflammation than something else. I'm big into ice baths for after, not over the top usage, but when I've really destroyed my legs from like a 15 stair, or like, I don't know, I just feel like I definitely want to try to skate the next day or later. I just feel like it's something to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like such an intense experience. It just feels like it must be doing something. You know?
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a good point, and I think that's why this kind of ice narrative is hung on for so long. Anybody who's done an ice bath knows how intense those things are. And dude, I used to do them after basketball practice. Let's be real, dude. They fucking suck.
Yeah.
They're miserable. Yeah, they're pretty brutal, but we kind of assume that the intensity of the ice bath or some of these ice treatments correlates with the level of effectiveness it has on the body, and that just isn't quite the case. Ice really doesn't do as much as far as decreasing inflammation as we feel like it does when we're in that ice bath.
Yeah.
So I think because ice in general is such a strong experience, people's opinions on how well it works are also strong as well. Does that kind of make sense? Am I explaining that right?
Yeah. And so what about how it affects muscle strength and speed? And like we've talked about with static stretching having negative effects on speed, power, performance, things like that. Like does ice impact any of those things?
Yeah, good question. The research is a little mixed on this. Some studies show a slight and temporary decrease in muscle power and strength and performance and stuff like that after icing. A lot of other studies, in fact, I would say most studies, show that ice doesn't really change those things either way. It has a neutral effect on performance and muscle power. So if you look at the research as a whole, I would say that ice physiologically doesn't have much impact either way on strength, power, performance, stuff like that.
Cool, so we've covered a lot. What are the main points everyone should take away from this little bonus episode that we have on icing?